1948. On the 4th of October 1948, Flight Lieutenant Young, my dad, Malta. So that's the timeline and where he fits in. Now I am going to jump forward to the 1994. And don't worry, I will be going back. But in 1994, I was in my first year of rabbinical school at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem on their beautiful campus. And I spent the year 1994 to 1995 there. But in November of 1994, I came back to the UK to see both my parents, who were long divorced and living in separate places. I spent a night with my father and we went out to the pub, as we always did. That was my father's go-to place. And because I was in Israel, my mind was thinking about historical events. And I knew that my father had been based on Malta, but I really didn't know much about what he had done there or where else he had been. And I asked my father if, while he was on Malta, he had ever visited Palestine. And he told me that actually he had been stationed in Palestine for 5 weeks in 1947, when some of the 73rd Squadron were flown in to help a squadron that was already there and was becoming overwhelmed by events. So he was just there for 5 weeks. And he was in an airfield north of Tel Aviv called Ramat David. And he told me that every night he had to go to sleep in his Spitfire with his pistol upon his lap, because both the Irgun from the Jewish side and the Arabs from the Arab side would like to have got their hands upon a Spitfire aeroplane, because it would have been enormously helpful in both their struggles. So I always found that a very evocative description, that that's what my father did for a short period where he was. But then he went on to tell me more of what he actually did for the 2 years that he was on Malta. And he told me that one of his jobs was to patrol the Mediterranean Sea. And when he was on duty, he would fly low across the sea, looking for ships that were coming so-called illegally to Palestine from Europe, ships that would be carrying hundreds, sometimes thousands, of Jews from the displaced people's camps in Europe. And we're sitting there in the pub, and my father told me that he remembers on one occasion flying very low over one of these ships. And he said to me that the Jews covered it like a swarm of ants. I went extremely silent when he told me what his part had been, and we never talked of it again. During the time that my father was on Malta, from September 46 to October 48, at least 34 refugee ships tried to get in to Palestine. And I can't say for certain which ones my father was involved with turning back. I'd like to share with you 3 pages of these ships. Oh, here they are. Here is the first page. And you can see this goes from September 1946 to March 1947, a list of ships. And one of them is highlighted in yellow, the Chaim Arlosoroff. And I will talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Page number 2, from March 1947 to September 1947. And in the middle, you have the Exodus highlighted. And I will, of course, be talking more about that. And the final page, October 1947 to April 1948, a month before the foundation, a few weeks before the foundation of the State of Israel. And so you can see all these ships were coming through, and my father and other officers' jobs were to intercept them. So I'm going to talk now about Chaim Arlosoroff, and you'll see why I'm talking about it in just a moment. So let me share with you some pictures of the Chaim Arlosoroff. This is the Chaim Arlosoroff as it is rammed by a British naval ship. And when my father had been with me in the pub, he had said to me, when I saw these ships covered with Jews, my job was then to call the Royal Navy and they would then intercept them. So you see that in action. Here is the Chaim Arlosoroff, and once again, here is the Chaim Arlosoroff. A very dramatic picture. So let me tell you a little bit about the Chaim Arlosoroff. It was originally called the Ulua, and it was captained by a man called Lerva Eliav. The Ulua, soon renamed the Chaim Arlosoroff, set sail from Marseille in February 1947. And that captain, Lerva Eliav, later wrote in a memoir. The Ulua arrived close to the shore on the 27th of February 1947. It was discovered by a British plane and then surrounded by 6 British warships. The 1,398 immigrants on board were deported to Cyprus. I spent a lot of time after my father died going through the logbooks, and it was really in 2017, with the 70th anniversary of the Exodus, that I started to think I could maybe match the logbooks to some of these famous events. So now I'd like to show my father's logbook for the 27th of February, 1947. So you can see here, 1947, February, and on the 27th of February, he was flying a Spitfire 9. He was the pilot, self, it says. What was his duty? He was flying in formation with 2 other aircraft across the Mediterranean Sea. That's all he says, because that's all he ever says, the very bare bones. He was flying over the sea. He was presumably looking for planes, for ships. And this is the day that a plane flew over the Chaim Arlosoroff. Was it my father? Of course, I can never know for certain. The most famous ships is, of course, the Exodus 1947. And here you can see the ship. It says on here the Haganah, because it was the Haganah, the organization that was promoting Aliyah to the nascent land of Israel, that had chartered this ship. Here you see its new name, the Exodus 1947. Here in Hebrew, you see Yitziat Me Europa, the going out, the exodus from Europe. It had originally been called the President Warfield, and it had actually been a pleasure boat around the Charleston Savannah area. But then when it was chartered, particularly for bringing refugees from Europe into Palestine, it was renamed the 1947 by the Haganah. And it set sail from France on the 11th of July, 1947, from a little port near Marseille. The Haganah ran a brilliant publicity campaign to ensure that the newspapers and the news cameras of the world were trained on this ship, carrying 4,554 refugees. It was grossly overcrowded, and it was very hard to be on that ship. The Haganah's idea was to humiliate the British in the eyes of the world and to weaken British resolve. And that worked. 10 months later, the British departed Palestine. An American journalist based in Palestine, Ruth Gruber, followed the whole Exodus affair as it unfolded. In her account, published a year later in 1948, she tells of, and I'm quoting from her book now, the eyes of British planes and destroyers patrolling the Mediterranean. And of course, amongst those eyes was my father. Ruth Gruber also writes movingly and horrifyingly about the conditions in the camps upon Cyprus where the people were then sent. And my father was very open with me that when he turned back the ships, the people were sent to Cyprus. That's what he told me. And Ruth Gruber talked about the stench of the camps on Cyprus and how she would go back to her hotel room and shower for as long as she could to try and get the stench out of her hair, but she never could. The stench of sweat, the stench of terrible living conditions, because the British had put these people who'd been in concentration camps back into a different kind of camp. In a book called The Exodus Affair, published by Aviva Halamish in 1998, she writes of how, and I'm quoting from her book, even as the immigrants were boarding her, the Exodus, Halamish describes how on the 12th of July, 1947, the captain recorded that they were being tailed by a British destroyer, which had been, quote, joined by a 4-engine airplane. On the 18th of July, 75 years ago today, the Exodus 1947 was boarded by the Royal Navy and after a fierce battle was returned to France, where its occupants went on hunger strike. And at the end of their hunger strike, they were deported by the British back to Germany, a final cruel insult. Most of them in the years did make it to Israel. This is a picture of the cover of Ruth Gruber's book. Exodus 1947, the ship that launched a nation, first published in 1948, republished in 1999, published again in 2007. And I know that we will be meeting Ruth Gruber's daughter, Elia, a little later. And perhaps if she wants to, she might say something more about this. I don't want to put her on the spot. But you can get this book. It's easily available and so well worth reading. Here's another book that came out in 1969, republished in 1995, David C. Holly, Exodus 1947. This would not be my first go-to book, but it is out there. And finally, The Exodus Affair by an Israeli academic, Aviva Halamish, published in 1998, published in Hebrew and then translated, Holocaust Survivors and the Struggle for Palestine. Both Ruth Gruber's book and Aviva Halamish's book are the two that I found most useful in my preparation for this. So I'll just reiterate that the dates of the Exodus 1947, she was on the sea from the 11th to the 18th of July. Well, it turns out that my father was on duty from the 15th to the 18th of July, so the last 4 days of the Exodus affair. But before I look at his logbooks, let's remind you about what Ian looked like at this time. Actually, I'll do that in just a moment when I've shown you the logbook. Forgive me, I'm going to the logbook first. So here you see, he came off duty. His last day of duty was the 8th of July, when in fact there was a big exercise on the island of Malta, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. He comes back on duty on the 15th. He's flying his Spitfire 9. He is doing dive bombing exercises. Also on the 15th, he flies from Takali, the RAF base on Malta, to Lucca, a small village on Malta. On the 16th, he is flying with 6 other aircraft in formation across the Mediterranean. It's very likely they overflew the Exodus. On the 17th, the day before the Exodus was boarded, he's flying his Spitfire, low flying over the sea. And of course, I remember vividly my father saying to me, I was flying low over the sea. And the Jews were like a swarm of ants upon the ship. And if you've seen pictures of the Exodus, absolutely covered, well, you could say, from a certain perspective, that they looked like a swarm of ants. And the day that the ship was boarded, my father is doing an air test. So it is very likely that my father overflew the Exodus. It is very likely that he helped turn it back. The 8th of July, Blue Flight, exercise defense of Malta, had taken place, a huge exercise across the island involving the whole squadron and lots of British army to defend Malta against a putative Soviet invasion. Here is my father, here is Ian, on the far left as you look at the screen. Here is Ian flying over the Mediterranean with Malta, at least I assume it's Malta, I don't know for certain, behind. And I also am unclear whether this is the wing here of my father's plane and he's taking the photograph. He did take many photographs from his plane, or whether this is his aircraft here and someone else photographed him. I don't know. And of course, I will never know. What would my father and his friends' opinions have been about what was going on in Palestine? I don't know. But I can tell you that public opinion in England was not hugely in the favor of the people on the Exodus and of the Jews in Palestine. When I discovered I was Jewish in 1983, I also discovered that I was the second cousin to a man who proved to be a great friend and help, and second cousin to me, the writer Frederick Raphael, whom some of you will know from his novel The Glittering Prizes, made into a very successful BBC series. He has also won an Oscar for his screenplays. He's had a very interesting career, but he's first and foremost a novelist. And in 1960, he published Limits of Love. The Limits of Love follows a Jewish family in the 1940s, the mid-1940s, exactly the time we're talking about. And I'm going to share a bit with you that focuses upon Colin, who is a Jewish man who had moved to South London. He's left behind his Jewish family in North London because they're all a bit too Jewish for him. And he's moved to South London, and he doesn't deny he's Jewish, but he really doesn't want to bring it up in conversation. And he's unsure if his neighbors know that he and his wife are Jewish. And this is what happens. And the week that is being described, the day that is being described, is just after the sergeant's affair, when the Irgun had hanged the 2 British sergeants. One morning, Colin came out of the front gate of Raven's Nook, just as Ted emerged from Balmoral. Bradshaw, his next door neighbour, was slapping the morning paper against his thigh. "Well, Colin," he called. "Morning, Ted." Colin waited for the other. "Coming to the station? Seen the paper this morning?" And glanced at it. "Seen what your people have been up to in Palestine?" Colin flushed. No. His eyes had come to censor such articles. "Well, take a look." Ted Bradshaw stretched the paper out in front of his neighbour's face. "Take a look, by God." "Dreadful," Colin said, "dreadful." "You know what I'd like to do this morning? I'd like to line up all the Jews from here to the bloody Viv and shoot the lot of them. Shoot the bloody lot. He grinned at Colin with yellow teeth. Not including you and Tessa, of course. So I see that my father, I can tell you because I knew him, he was not a perfect man by any means. And he abandoned my mother and I. But I never heard him say anything racist, anything anti-Semitic. That wasn't who he was. But as a young man, what did he feel about these people who were in battle from his point of view against the British Army, Air Force? I don't know. We didn't that. But I always think that this piece from Frederick Raphael might have summed up what he and his colleagues would have been thinking. Now, I want to take you back to that pub in 1994. I've told you how my father and I never spoke of it again, but how did it affect me? I was extremely shaken. I went back to Jerusalem, back to my classes, and the very next day, I was taking a literature class with a great Israeli writer and scholar called Ada Pagis. She herself had been slightly put into the shadows by her more famous late husband, who was the Israeli poet Dan Pagis. And some of you may know perhaps his most famous poem. Katuv be'iparon, b'karon he chatum, written in pencil in the sealed freight car. Kan b'mishloach hazeh ani chava, im hevel b'ni. Im tiru et b'ni hagadol kain ben adam, tagidu lo she'ani. Here in this carload, I, Eve, with my son Abel, if you see my older son Cain, the son of Adam, tell him that I... Ada, on this particular lesson, put a text in front of us, as she always did. And the text came from this book, The Story of a Life by Aharon Appelfeld. And as we began to study this piece of prose that the great Israeli writer Aharon Appelfeld, who was born in Europe and came to Israel in 1946 from a displaced persons camp, as we started to read it, I just felt so miserable I cannot begin to tell you. And you'll see why when I share this with you. This is the quote from the book that we read. I returned to 1946, the year I came to Israel. On the ship and afterward, at the camp at Atlit, where we were interned by the British, learned some Hebrew words. And I won't go on because that's as far as I took in. I was sitting in this room with my rabbinic trainee colleagues, with Ada Pagis. I just learned what I had learned from my father, and now I learned that Aharon Appelfeld was intercepted by the British, not by my father, because he wasn't there in 46. Well, he was there in 46, actually, but I don't think that it was early enough for him to have been involved in this, but again, I can't be sure. He was interned at Atlit on the Israeli mainland south of Haifa. So I read this and I just felt I had to share what I have told you, the conversation I just had with my father. So I told the form room, I told Ada, and Ada went completely silent. The silence in the room was truly terrible. She stared at me. And then she said to me, in 1946, I was on a refugee ship coming from Europe. We got sight of coast of Israel, and an RAF ship flew low over, an RAF plane, excuse me, flew low over our ship. And we knew it was all over. And I was taken away with everyone else and interned in a DP camp on Cyprus. So she says that to me and to the whole class. And I am so cold inside. And she is silent again. And then she says, in the DP camps of Cyprus, I was taught to hate the British soldiers and airmen. But somehow, she said, I never did. She was silent again. And then she said to me, and who would ever have thought that 50 years later, I would be teaching the son of one of those men to be a rabbi in Jerusalem? She got up from her seat at the end of the room and she walked towards me around the table. She walked up to me and she gestured to me to get out of my chair. And she put her arms around me and she held me tight. In 1999, I did my senior sermon at Hebrew Union College in New York. And I talked about how when one has difficult parents, sometimes one can find substitute parents as we journey through life, who help us to honor the fifth commandment that says we must kibud av v'em, we must honor our parents. What do we do when we can't always honor them fully? Well, sometimes we find other parents. And Ada was one of those parents to me. And I wrote about her in my sermon as a parent. And I sent her my sermon and she sent back a letter to me. And I will share just a beautiful sentence from it. The 4th of April, 1998, Dear Roderick. And here is a red dot. And after the red dot, it says, I am happy for you that you are finding your way in this chaos of your childhood. And I was so happy to give her a little in the sermon of the gift that she had given me. I told you that my father died in 2003. And I told you that we never discussed what he had told me ever again. I saw him a month before he died in November 2003. And he was 77, he was perfectly healthy. And he said something odd to me as I was driving away. He said, if anything happens to me, everything you need is in the bureau in the sitting room. And I said, nothing's going to happen to you. You're perfectly healthy. He was dead a month later of a heart attack. When I went through the bureau, I found many things in it, but I found in particular a scrap of paper, and it had been written on the back of an envelope, and the envelope was date marked, postmarked, November 1994. In other words, the very month that he and I had had the conversation. And it became clear to me he'd left me this little scrap of paper with disjointed thoughts that he'd written immediately that he saw how upset I was. He'd left it for me to find. And here is my final slide to share with you tonight. It says here, 47 to 48 May, Ramat David, question mark. That's the airfield where he was. How long? 5 weeks. How many? And then I don't know what his train of thought was. Then he writes, there, mid-47, returned Malta when UNCOP, he's left out the S, it should be UNSCOP, was set up. The 208 Squadron, that was in Palestine, was overstretched. Egypt and Syria overflying Palestine in support of Arabs. Britain said no. to 100,000 invasion. And I'm glad he's put that word invasion in quotation marks, because spoil balance between Jew, Arab. Stern gang actively terrorizing Brit units. So he wrote that in November 1994, and I discovered it when I went through the bureau in early 2004, 10 years later. I'd never before set eyes on this torn envelope, but here, a month after Ian's death, my father seemed to be reaching out to justify his role and perhaps to acknowledge my pain. Thank you all very much for listening to my story.
Thank you so much, Roderick, for sharing it with us. It's a hugely emotional story, very powerful, and we're really grateful that you've been so open and honest with us, and that you're here today, 75 years on from that moment your father was flying over. And I noticed there were 2 entries in his logbook for 18th of July. One said air test, but the one below it said something like formations and bouncing. Is that bouncing back the ships?
No, I as far as I know, it's like balancing of the aeroplanes. They had to do these tests because they used to do bombing raids. They used to go down to a small island off much farther south, off Sicily, I think, and do these bombing raids and bomb the island into smithereens. And I think that's what the balancing was. I believe so.
Wow. Well, it's very interesting. You're doing this motion, and that was an incredibly balanced account of what is a very heated moment and a powerful moment. So thank you. And we're going to bring Roderick back a little bit later, Rabbi Young back a little bit later, to take questions from all of you, should you wish to ask him. So Rabbi Young has been talking to us about the complications of a difficult parent, or a parent who maybe his actions and values aren't in line with your own. The person I'm going to bring in next is the opposite. She's someone who's absolutely followed in her mother's footsteps. So Rabbi Young referred to Ruth Gruber, the reporter who wrote the first book about the Exodus experience, and from whose photographs and writing in news articles the world found out what was happening. Ruth is an extraordinary figure, and her daughter isn't any less extraordinary. Her daughter Celia I'm going to bring in a moment, but I thought first of all I'll just quickly introduce you to Ruth with a piece of video footage. So a documentary was made about Ruth's work. The documentary itself is too long to share as part of this session, but I thought I'd share the trailer for it, which focuses on this particular piece of reporting in Exodus, amongst other amazing things she did. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show you the little clip from the documentary, and then I'm going to bring in Celia for a moment and talk about Celia's work, but ask Celia to talk a little bit about her mother's perception of what happened on the Exodus. So here we go.
I was always restless. I had to get away. I had to get out of Brooklyn. They were squeezing me. My father, he'd say, "You have to have a career." I said, "I want to be a writer." What kind of career is that for a nice Jewish girl?
Ruth Gruber is a writer and a lecturer and is the youngest PhD in the world and is quite good looking.
I was a rebellious kid. I wanted to encompass the whole world. I wanted to know what everything was like. So that really set my whole course. I was a foreign correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune. Hitler was coming into power, and I pretended I was a German citizen, and I sat as the closest to Hitler's podium. His voice was something that I will never, ever forget. You took pictures. You carried a camera. I demand the camera and I demand the pictures. I realized what these people had gone through, and I knew that I had to get their stories. My editor said, these pictures, they don't belong to you. They belong to the world. When we came to the ship, the soldiers gave her a pair of pants because she had a tight skirt on, so she could go on that ladder. And somebody said, "Ah, it's Eleanor Roosevelt." My mother said, "Mr. Secretary, you're sending my daughter to Europe now in the middle of the war. How do I know she'll come home safe?" "Don't worry, Mother. We're making her a general."
So you were not just a journalist?
Never.
Never.
So you've just had a tiny, tiny taste of the remarkable Ruth Gruber. I came to do this session today because I realised the date last summer. I teach a modern Jewish literature class, and last summer I taught the course on Leon Uris's book, Exodus, which I would suspect is what introduced many people in this Zoom to the story. And I have to say, I was so disappointed with what he did with the journalist figure, because there it was. You see it in the book, you see it in the film, you know, an average, you know, middle-aged white male figure. And actually the real journalist, and Leon Uris got a lot of his material from Ruth's book, was this remarkable young woman who just was Jewish, so she identified herself, but she stood on the shore, watched what was happening, and made this decision that the world had to know. And she brought attention to the hunger strikes that were happening. She brought attention to the fact that the British were sending these ships back to Europe, and that here were these Holocaust survivors going back to displaced persons camps. And many people say that it was her reporting that completely changed the narrative around in America and in Britain around the need for the state of Israel, and that the fact that these survivors should be allowed in. Her daughter is equally remarkable. So in a moment, I'm going to bring in Celia Michaels. I'm very, very grateful to Celia for agreeing to be here with us. Celia also is a journalist. Let me bring Celia up. But Celia is a film editor rather than, or a news editor rather than a news reporter. She followed in her mother's footsteps, working in the family business. And actually during university, she was Ruth Gruber's photographer herself. And she went with her to Moscow, to Vietnam and South Korea. Celia then started her own career, which was primarily in TV news and documentaries. And she was the only CBS editor in Beirut when the Amal took over. And she then was sent all over the world, all over the US too. But the world internationally was probably most interesting. She was sent to Cairo, Moscow and London, and she reported on the First Gulf War. And she was very honoured to join her mum on a panel for female foreign correspondents in Oxford because of her own work as well as her mother's. So I'm just going to ask Celia to just talk for a little bit about what your mum told you about that experience of seeing the Exodus trying to reach Palestine as it then was, and how that impacted her and her future career.
Well, yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Viva, and thank you, Rabbi Roderick. Your story is so moving, and really, thank you. But yes, my mother. This was among the most important parts of my mother's life. It really changed her so much. She she was the only photographer allowed on one of the ships. And so her most famous photographs are of the people in that ship, of this woman holding up the baby and saying, please take a picture of my baby. I don't matter anymore. I'm going to die, but I had this baby who's going to go and live in Palestine. And as a matter of fact, I spoke to somebody today who told me that at the time, the DP camps had the highest birth rate in the world because people were just they just wanted to start again. But for my mother herself, it was just, she'd asked to go on these jobs. She was born in America and grew up in America, but she got her PhD in Germany, and she was the youngest PhD in the world, as you saw in the trailer. But she.
Okay. Hold on one moment, Celia.
Sure.
People are saying that you're a little bit quiet. Would you be able to turn up your volume or go near your microphone?
I'll come and I'll. How's this, everybody? Give me a thumbs up if that's working better. I'll speak
That's
louder.
a little better.
Thank
Brilliant.
You. All right. Okay. Anyway, these it was so important for my mother to cover the ships, to follow the story of the Jews before the Holocaust. She went and found a lot of her relatives in various parts of what's now Ukraine, really. Ukraine and somewhat the old Soviet Union. And of course, none of them survived. But it was, my mother's brother was able to find the people that my mother lived with in Germany when she was getting her PhD. But the story of the Exodus I don't even know. I apologize. It was such a moving time for her. She had to be a journalist in each of these cases. When she thought the ships were going to Cyprus, she flew to Cyprus. When they didn't land, she understood they were going to France, so she went to France. She so wanted to find these people and tell their stories, and basically so much of their stories were just that they wanted to get to Palestine, that other people, that it was so clear that people didn't want them, that they were thought of as Rabbi Roderick said, as ants, as nothing, as whatever they were thought of, and the only way for them to begin a life was to start again. And I'm very grateful to you, Aviva, and to this group for just keeping my mother's work alive. So as you said, Aviva, when Otto Preminger was going to make the film Exodus, he'd asked Leon Uris for the books that contributed to his writing, and the book, he got my mother's book. And Preminger called my mother, and I'm not going to do the accent, but said, if I'd read this first, I would have made this film. So, another life.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to bring you back in a little bit later to take some questions from the audience. But just talking about films and lives, another film and life, I want to show one more film before we do so. So thank you in advance for, like Rabbi Roderick, being willing to open up your personal story to us and your mother's personal story to us, because as also Preminger thought, it's way more interesting than the novel ever was. So we'll see you in a minute, but one more film first, because we have looked from above at this ship. We've looked from the shore to this ship, and even with Ruth briefly climbed on board. But I want us to zoom right in to the participants, or to the people who were on the ship itself. And to do that, I'm going to bring in Sephardi voices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by asking, hopefully, Bear Lefkowitz if her technology will hold up. And if not, Daisy will speak for her. But I'm going to bring Bear on, hopefully, to talk about interviewing Naomi Pope, who was a British survivor of the Exodus. We'll then, once Bear's talked to us about it, we'll watch a clip from that interview of Naomi talking about her experiences. And then we'll bring up Naomi's daughter, Juliet. So actually Naomi's son Jonathan is with us, her daughter's Juliet with us, and also Jonathan and Juliet's cousin Michael are here too. So we've got the whole Pope family, but Juliet's going to be the initial spokesperson. So we'll hear from Bear about the interview, we'll watch the interview, and then we'll ask Juliet a little bit about her mother, and then we're going to bring everybody together, all three descendants of the different, representing the different elements of the story, and be in conversation with them. Speyer, over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Aviva. I'm really very, very happy. Thank you for the talk so far. And I'm so happy that we can screen to you a short excerpt with the interview with Naomi Pope, which I conducted for Sephardi Voices UK, which is an organization which is collecting interviews of Jews from the Middle East and from North Africa who came to Britain. And I just have to say very briefly, it was the Exodus which brought me to Naomi. And it is actually, I just checked it, we conducted the interview exactly 10 years ago in July 2012. So why did the Exodus bring me to Naomi? Because the Jewish Museum at the time commissioned David Cesarani and myself to talk to Naomi and her friend about her experiences of the Exodus. And we had quite a long interview with both of them. And following that interview, I asked Naomi if we could interview her for Sephardi Voices, because she was born in Burma, had gone to Calcutta, and then came to Britain. And she said yes, and I came back and did this interview. And it was a very moving interview because, for me to interview somebody who had been a volunteer on the Exodus was quite remarkable. And you will see it in a minute for yourself. But I just want to say, also, her interview finishes with a very, very lovely message to everyone. And she talks about the choices she had and that she was very proud to have made these choices. And her very last message is to anyone who will watch that interview. So I'll share this with you now. She says, the only thing you can say to anyone is you must follow your star. You must believe you've got a star and follow it. So I'm very pleased that we can now show the 6 minutes of the interview with Naomi Pope.
Thank you so much, Bear. And Daisy, please will you bring up, there we go, the interview.
We were picked because we were strong, healthy, good, I suppose, good role models for the people who would be going on the boat, who were DPs, came out of camps with very low morale, sick. And the boat that was supposed to take them was a special boat because it was going to take 5,000 people, the biggest boat that went. It was supposedly strong and fitted out, and pregnant women were going, and young children and orphans from the camps. We were training every night. We'd be woken up by the siren, and we'd put our packs on and run downstairs and form into groups, ready to go. So every night we didn't know if that was the night we were going to go or not. And this went on for 2 or 3 weeks. And then one night, it was the night, and I still get very overcome when I think about it. So we got on the lorries, and the lorries rolled through the night, and in the early morning, we got out, and there was the boat You know, it's haunted me my whole life. And we all had false passports, which were Colombian or some. We all had different passports. There were little bits of paper, and we were on the boat. And I was used to ocean liners, and this was a little boat, you know, a very little boat, and lots of people. In the ocean liners, you had a handful of people really pro rata. So it was kind of shock that we were all going on it, but so long awaited that let's get on and, you know, get on with it. The night before, up went the Exodus in 1947, and you know, we were sort of singing and happy and dancing even on the top, because we were on the top deck, and really sort of absolutely thrilled. I can honestly say I didn't have a moment's fear. Not even now when I think of it. You know, just the thrill of being there. It was something that was worth doing. The journey took 5 days. We were told that there's no way we're not going to get into Israel because this boat is big. It's been hotted up. That when we get in territorial area, 3 miles out of the country, it'll go full speed ahead, land in Tel Aviv on the sand, you know, beach itself. We're all going to jump off and assimilate with the people, which did happen on 1 or 2 boats. And, you know, it's going to be fine. In the morning, when it was light and we were right down below, but we were allowed to go upstairs on the deck. We took turns, you know, with other people. When we looked out, there were 5 I don't know what you call them, cruisers. 5 British warships following. 3, eventually it came to 7. So they were just following. We were going along and they were either side. So the 4-5 days they were with us. And on the night before we were supposed to make our dash, the boats in English were making declarations, you know, turn back, go, make for, turn your boat, turn your boat. And Haganah realized they'd have to go earlier. It was outside the 3-mile limit. And there's no chance, but they made a dash for it. And the boats, as we started to go, the boats came, if this is that, the boats came in, banged it, when the next lot came in, so they came in waves, banging the boat. Luckily, it broke the sides, but it was still ricketing along. And then they boarded, and they killed the man at the wheel. They were all American volunteers, the crew. Anyway, they killed a few people. They killed 2 or 3 children. We were on the top deck. All we had no ammunition. We had just tins of food, and we were sort of throwing it at the boarding party, but it didn't make much difference. And then they used gas, and when they used gas, we were done. You know, it was a horrible, horrible feeling. So we were just knocked out or lying about, and they took over the boat, and it drifted into Haifa. And the following, as soon as it reached Haifa, we were taken off, deloused, and put on a British prison ship. So that was the end of that.
Thank you so much to Sephardi Voices for that extraordinary clip of that interview with Naomi. And we're really lucky that we have Juliet here, Juliet Landau Pope, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Daisy to bring Juliet on screen with Bea. And Juliet, maybe you would tell us a little bit about your mum and respond to what Bea said about, you know, that positivity she had at the ending and that determination and drivenness too.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I hope I'm going to be able to speak because I'm so churned up. I have seen the film, the video of my mum, but not since she died. She died. And since then, I haven't seen her on film. So forgive me. My mum was amazing. My mum was absolutely amazing. And we couldn't be prouder of her. She was, I just wanted to say, I'm so glad that this session is taking place, and I'm so grateful to Bea and to Jewish Renaissance for documenting her role, because the 7 British Jewish volunteers who went, who sailed on the Exodus, not as Holocaust survivors, they were Jewish, they were my mum was 18 years old, she was a teenager. And she was a member of Habonim, the socialist Zionist youth movement. They went because they were passionate Zionists. They were absolutely passionate ideologues, and they wanted to build the state of Israel, and they wanted to help. They wanted to do their bit. And sadly, the role of these 7 volunteers has not been documented. I've read the books, all the wonderful books, and I'm not putting down the books that Rabbi Roderick mentioned. The role of my mother and her peers is not mentioned in those books. I know there were lots of other things going on also. I'm not blaming anybody, but it is a story that needs to be told. And we have my mother's video footage. I also have letters. I have notes that my mother's written, and I have more to say. And I would love her story to be more of her story, not just her story, but the 7 Brits. My mother was the youngest. The others were slightly older. They were in their early 20s. They came from Leeds, from Manchester, from London, and they were kids who wanted to help, who wanted to be part of history. And that was my mother. She was always, she carried that idealism. She carried her Zionism, and also very proud of her British identity. I think there's a little bit of it's kind of paradox that even though she was, you know, that it was the British who turned them back, and she had witnessed violence, she also recounted, I'm sorry, I'll just tell one brief story. Once she was on the British prison boat being taken back to Hamburg, she fell ill, she fainted, and she told me, I think it's in the film as well, that she was looked after. She was taken to the hospital area on the boat, and she was looked after by British nurses. And she was afraid at the time to reveal that she was British. So she spoke Hindustan. She'd grown up in Burma and Calcutta, spoke Hindi. So she spoke Hindi, pretended not to be British. She didn't look British, and she didn't have a British passport. And she was afraid that if she was revealed as British, she would be prosecuted. And that was actually something I think she kind of carried with her. I think she was also always a little bit reluctant. She did give interviews, but she was a little reluctant to talk openly about her role because of that, you know, ambivalence about being British. But she was very proud of being British and being Jewish and being a Zionist. So that was my mum.
Oh,
Was that woman we interviewed her first with David Cesarani, was that one of the other 7 volunteers, her friend?
Yes, that was my mum's closest, dearest friend, whose name was Sheila Ben Yehuda, who died just 2-3 years ago, I think. There were 7 of them. Sheila was one of my mum's closest friends, and together with the group, they founded Kibbutz Kfar Hanassi, and Sheila remained on Kfar Hanassi for the rest of her life, and together with her family. But she used to visit my mum. She used to come to London, and my mother, our family used to go to Israel regularly, and we'd always go to the kibbutz and spend time with Sheila and some of the others. Of the 7, Molly and Len lived in London, came back to London. Peter, who was from Leeds, I think stayed in Israel. I don't recall offhand the names of the others, but I do have them if anybody wants to follow up.
Should get hold of that interview at the Jewish Museum, because they must have that.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, talking about getting hold of interviews, I'm going to just briefly ask Daisy to pop on, because Daisy is going to tell us about how people can get hold of that whole interview with your mother. So Daisy, who's the Deputy Director of Sephardi Voices.
And thank you everyone who's spoken. It's been an amazing event. I just wanted to say very briefly, yeah, your mum, Juliet, does mention all of the names in her interview with Sephardi Voices. It was so hard to cut down that interview into 6 minutes. I can't even tell you how difficult that was, because there's so much just absolutely amazing information in it. And I'm working on a slightly longer 10-minute version. So if anyone watching does want to kind of sign up, subscribe to Sephardi Voices UK through our website, then you will get an email when that is ready, because it's just an amazing testimony. So yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that is happening slowly.
What I'm going to do is, in the follow-up email, because we always say send the recording of these events out to all of you who participated, and also we have another 30-40 people who booked but couldn't watch. We'll put the details for Sephardi Voices in there, so you can contact Daisy and Bayer about the film. We'll put the information about Ruth Gruber's book in there. We'll put the article that Bayer did for Jewish Renaissance about Naomi, and we'll probably send you as well. I will ask Rabbi Roderick for his permission, but we might also be able to send you the text of an article he wrote. Now, talking of Rabbi Roderick, I'd just like for the last 10 minutes to bring Celia and Rabbi Roderick back on screen. So fantastic, thank you. So we actually have, and I think it's probably the first time virtually or in person, all three of you have been together, is that right? So we have these three people with these three amazing stories about the Exodus 1947 and these amazing parents. And I'm so struck about how different your relationships are to each of them and to the story, but you've all said, and I'm grateful to that you're willing to take questions. If there is anybody in our audience who would like to ask anything, please do put your virtual hand up. And I will bring you on screen, or put a note in the chat and I'll bring you on screen to ask. We've just got 10 minutes more, but I'm going to kick off with a question of my own, which is that 75 years on from this moment, first of all, how do you think having a parent who's involved has affected you personally, like in terms of the way you see the world now? You know, this is a story about refugees, it's a story about Zionism, it's a story about British identity. How does that impact you, and how's it shaped your lens on what's happening in today's world at all? Maybe we'll start with Rabbi Roderick.
Thank you, Aviva. For me, it's very complicated, given that I feel horrified by my father's past. That's balanced with the fact that I know, to use the cliche, he was only obeying orders. And I also know that it probably didn't mean a great deal to him as a 25-year-old or whatever he was. But I would like him to have been more attuned to the tragedy that was unfolding below his aeroplane. So I carry around with me the sense that it's not my fault that my dad did that, but at the same time, we are the products of where we come from. You know me well, Aviva, and other people here know me well, that I've been very open about the story of discovering my mom was Jewish, which is another dramatic story, but I've not been so open about this one until recently, because this is very hard for me, because I love Israel. And I am what we would call these days a liberal Zionist, and I love the country. And so it's personal baggage for me that's very difficult. And it just makes me realize how that small country, how the birth of that small country rose against the odds. And I'm very glad that the country of which I am a citizen and perfectly proud to be British was defeated on that at that moment, and that the British mandate, had to disappear with its tail between its legs. I'm extremely glad of that. So I would say it's complicated, and I have to have rachmanut, I have to have mercy and sympathy towards my father, but at the same time, I am not happy with the role he played.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for your honesty. Juliet, I know you're quite active now in social justice work too. So how has this shaped you and what you do and how you see the world?
Well, I'm less active now than I have been in the past, but I think the core values that my mother passed to me, and my father, by the way, I think one of the things that my parents shared was this sense of commitment to justice and tikkun olam, and just wanting to make the world a better place, and feeling a real sense of responsibility. And I think that's definitely something that they passed on to me. Something else my mum's passed on to me is the not to be afraid to stand out and to stand up. That was always something that she talked about, being different. And I think she grew up feeling very different. She had a very unconventional childhood and an unconventional personal history. And then in her later years, when she often used to say about herself, when people see a middle-class Jewish housewife we grew up in Chigwell, and then before the last few years she moved to Finchley, she said, people don't realize who I really am, and I think that sense of being different, speaking out against what's wrong, whether it's in England, whether it's in Israel, wherever it is definitely something she's passed on to me. Yeah. And that she often used to say, don't be afraid, Lola Fachet Klal. That was one of her expressions. She was fearless. She was absolutely fearless.
And of course, Lola Fachet Klal comes after the phrase, Gesha,
Yes.
The world's a very narrow bridge, but the essential thing is not to be afraid. And I think there is a narrow bridge here. I mean, we've just seen that precariousness, and I think there's a precariousness across the whole world as well, but we're seeing a lot of it with current American politics too. Celia, first of all, what's the impact, other than forming your professional life, what's the impact of your mum personally, but also how did she take what she saw in the Exodus and use it then to negotiate kinds of the role of America in the world and what it was able to do? Oh, you need to unmute. There we go. No, it's fine. We can hear you.
I am unmuted. I think I'm unmuted.
Yeah. Just come a little bit closer to the mic.
Excuse me, everybody. Yes, I think, very soon after this, or actually earlier in 43, really, my mother had been working for the American government, and then she was back in journalism, but she saw that America was going to save some Jewish refugees out of Italy. So she went to the father of one of the people you saw in the trailer, who was the Secretary of the Interior, and said, I must go. I must be the one to bring these people over. And I think she felt very involved with refugees and change, certainly with Israel. She covered every aliyah to Israel through the Ethiopians. In 75, she actually followed the trail of Ethiopian Jews through the Sudan. And I mean, my mother was pretty amazing, really. But she also was called on in America. She was often, journalists or television programs asked her to speak about different refugee situations. And, she'd be heartbroken now. There's a level, she died in 2016 at actually 105, but the last 2 years she wasn't really compos mentis. But prior to that, she really was. And we think on some level she'd seen this movie before. She saw a lot of rise of fascism throughout the world. And I think she was ready to go, really. But but yes, she and I also, Lola Fached, yes, we all, my mother was out there. And there were certain areas where I think she was afraid. But in terms of helping other people and seeing and doing something, it was very clear to her that she just followed her star, her something. And Juliet, I want to thank you for your mother's work as well. I mean, really, this time has been so moving for me. So thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thank you. We are almost out of time. So we have lots of comments in the chat from people who also had refugee experiences or people on the boats. There was one question actually about the numbers of boats, but I might get Roderick to give us that information and we'll forward it to you afterwards with all the other references. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to bring one person in because I am aware it's a very hot evening and we've got to stick to time. This event has been organised by Jewish Renaissance with thanks to Sephardi Voices, but the funding and impetus behind it comes from the Lions Learning Project. And the Lions Learning Project is led by Rabbi Sybil Sheridan. And I know that she's got things she wants to say to all of you. So I'm going to bring Rabbi Sheridan in to have that final discussion with you in the Q&A and do a thank you as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, I think this has been the most extraordinary evening to bring three such diverse people together in such an event. You know, this should really go down in the history books, I feel. You know, it's part of the history of the story of Exodus 1947. I mean, one thing that struck me very much, we as Aviva will tell you that we wanted to keep this very secret, the discovery that, you know, tonight was the 75th anniversary, because we were terrified that all sorts of other organizations and institutions would have the same idea. But I have to say, I'm finding it personally very shocking that nobody else has picked up on this. And what does that mean about the story of the Exodus? And particularly in the light of the immigration crisis that we are experiencing at the moment, that people don't seem to know what happened. And I'm so grateful to the three of you because you are clearly speaking about it and informing the next generation of those experiences of your parents. Three very, very different, but really fascinating stories. I mean, I was so privileged, I feel, to hear Juliet's description of her mother. That was wonderful, and awed indeed, Celia, about the work of your mother. And I have to confess to knowing very little about her, but I will definitely go away now and read her book. That's just quite incredible. And Roderick, of course, for you to open up the way you did was so moving. And again, I think, you know, we all want to hear more. So thank you, all three of you, for really what I think was a very special evening indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sybil, and thank you to Lions Learning for making this possible. And I just want to say, Rabbi Roderick, you took us through all the history as well. Huge amount of work, I know, went into that presentation, and research is incredible, and your knowledge on this is incredible. So we will maybe pass on the article you first published about this, if that's all right, to everyone who came. But I just want to say a particular thank you for all that hard work. And I also want to advertise what's coming next, because it's not unrelated. This was a session about a moment in history, but it was also a session about complex family relationships. So I guess I'm obsessed with picking up on unusual anniversaries. I didn't realise that no one else had picked up on this one, but we've got another anniversary coming up in the autumn that a lot of people have picked up on, but we have a very special perspective on. So the Jewish Renaissance and Lions Learning Programme is now going quiet. We all need some time off over the month of August. But September and October, we're focusing on the Freud family. So for all of you interested in complex parent-child dynamics, this autumn is actually the centenary of Lucian Freud, and that's being marked by exhibitions at the National Gallery and at the Freud Museum. We are going to have we'll be doing curator-led tours in October. But we have a specific perspective on this. Everyone is looking at Freud as a great painter. We at Jewish Renaissance are looking at him as the product of a Jewish emigre family, and what that means. How does Jewish identity complicate all these experiences? And of course, both Sigmund and Clement Freud escaped from the Nazis too, and came to the UK. So what we're going to do is we're starting off on the 18th of September, so 2 months today. Esther Freud is going to join us for an online book club. Esther wrote a novel, The Sea House, which was about her grandfather, Ernest Freud. It's thinly disguised, who was an architect, about his refugee experience and him then coming and living in the UK. So she's going to talk both about her novel, but about the real family history, that emigre Jewish family history of the Freud family. And then throughout October, on Thursday lunchtimes, we'll be alternating online lunchtime lectures with biographers of the Freud family and other members of the Freud family, with, as I say, curator-led tours to the National Gallery and the Freud Museum exhibitions. So I hope you will join us for that too. Very different, but also interesting kind of part of Jewish emigre history. But really, thank you again. Thank you for marking today with us all. And Juliet, Celia, Rabbi Roderick, we really appreciate you taking the time to share your stories with us. Have a good summer, everyone. A good night.